I was halfway through changing the oil in my truck when I heard the sirens. Again. I wiped my hands on a rag and looked up just in time to see a patrol car roll to a stop in front of my house. The officer stepped out, hand resting casually on his belt. He looked tired. Probably because this was the third time in 2 months he'd been called to my driveway. And every single time it was because of her Glenda Rusk, the HOA vice president, self-appointed morality czar and full-time menace to the neighborhood. Let me back up. My name's Waylon Dorsey. I bought this house 8 years ago, and with it came a deeded parking spot right next to my garage. It's marked, documented, and mine just like the house. I even have the original closing paperwork in a fireproof box in my office, just in case. Never thought I'd have to use it to defend a slab of concrete, but here we are. 3 weeks ago, Glenda got elected vice president of the HOA after the previous one stepped down. She wasted no time. First, it was unsightly trash bins. Then she tried to force people to repaint mailboxes. But her real obsession, parking, she claimed my spot belonged to the HOA and accused me of stealing common property. I laughed. She didn't today, she went nuclear. I walked to the edge of the driveway and nodded at the officer. "Mornin', let me guess parking dispute," he sighed. "Yeah, miss. Rusk called, said you were illegally parked on HOA property and refused to move." I pointed at the ground. "You mean my spot that's in my deed?" Before he could respond, Glenda marched out of her house 2 doors down, clipboard in hand, sunglasses too big for her face. "That spot is for visitors, officer. It's not his." I turned to her. "Glenda, we've been over this. That spot came with the house. It's in my purchase agreement. You can't just rewrite property lines because you don't like where I park." She shot me a look like I'd insulted her dog. "Don't you raise your voice at me, Mr. Dorsey. As HOA vice president, I have the authority to regulate misuse of shared space." The officer raised a brow. "Ma'am, unless you have legal documentation showing this isn't his property, there's nothing we can do." "Oh, I do," she snapped. "I have the amended HOA map from last year. We rezoned that area as shared visitor parking." I nearly choked. "You what?" She pulled a folded paper from her clipboard and handed it to the officer. He scanned it, then handed it back. "This isn't a legal survey. This is a photocopy of a map someone drew in pen. It was voted on at the last meeting," she said proudly. I stepped forward, which I didn't attend because I was working a double shift. "Not that it matters, you can't vote away private property." "Then why don't we let the court decide?" she snapped. "I'll file a formal complaint with the HOA board." "You do that," I said. "And I'll show them the original deed with the parcel number and attached lot map." The officer looked between us, clearly done with the whole thing. "Unless someone's been assaulted or there's a real emergency, I'm heading out." He left. Glenda didn't. She stood there, arms crossed, watching me like a hawk as I walked back to my garage. I could feel her eyes burning into my back. That night, I installed a new security camera facing the driveway. Something told me this wasn't over, and I was right. 2 days after the officer left, I came home from a 12-hour shift and found a bright orange sticker slapped across my windshield. "Unauthorized vehicle subject to tow," it read in bold black letters. My heart dropped for half a second until I saw the signature scribbled at the bottom. "Approved by HOA VPG Rusk." I pulled out my phone and took photos from every angle, making sure the timestamp was clear. Then I peeled the sticker off carefully, tossing it in a plastic zip bag with a label. I wasn't about to let this slide. The next morning, I drove straight to city zoning and land records. The clerk, a soft-spoken guy named Barry, pulled my file from the archives. He laid out the original plat map, deed, and property line documentation on the counter. "Yep," he said, tapping a square with a pen. "This parking spot is explicitly included in your parcel. It was sold as a private easement attached to your home. It's not common property, no matter what your HOA thinks." I asked him for certified copies, which he printed and sealed in a manila envelope, then handed over with a nod. If they try to tow you again, they're violating municipal code. Could even be considered property interference. That was all I needed to hear. I spent the rest of the day filing a cease and desist letter through my attorney, a friend of my cousin who owed me a favor. We sent it directly to the HOA board and CC'd the city's community affairs office, along with photographic evidence and the certified land documents. I also filed a report with the local precinct documenting the sticker incident as attempted interference with private property. By that evening, the neighborhood group chat, which I rarely paid attention to, was blowing up. Apparently, Glenda had gone door to door handing out flyers claiming I was abusing the system and refusing to follow newly adopted HOA guidelines. She even included a QR code to a petition to remove me from my own spot for community harmony. But something must have backfired, because by nighttime, 3 neighbors came by, all of them apologetic and embarrassed. "Glenda told us you were squatting on HOA land," said a retired firefighter named Ed. "Didn't know it was in your deed. She left that part out." "She tends to leave a lot out," I said, handing him a copy of the city-certified map. He whistled low. "She's in for it." The next morning, I was sipping coffee on the porch when a tow truck rolled down the street. It pulled right into my driveway. I stood. The driver stepped out holding a clipboard. "Got a dispatch call to remove a gray Silverado from this location." "You're looking at the owner," I said. He blinked. "This spot yours?" I handed him the certified deed copy. "This is private property. If you touch my vehicle, it's trespassing. I've already filed with the city and the police." "Want me to call them now or after you hook it?" He studied the document, then the driveway, then back to me. "Nope, not worth it." He climbed into the cab and made a U-turn. Glenda was standing at the end of her walkway, arms stiff at her sides. She shouted something I didn't catch, then stormed back inside. That afternoon, I called the city's Neighborhood Legal Advisory Board and requested a formal review of the HOA's recent amendments, including their so-called rezoning map. I sent them scanned copies of every flyer, sticker, and petition page I'd collected, along with a copy of the tow dispatch order. They told me it would take about a week, but they'd prioritize it due to potential HOA overreach. 4 days later, I noticed something strange. A large manila envelope had been slid halfway under my doormat. No postage, no name. Inside were 5 pages of internal HOA email printouts. The top email made my jaw tighten. It was from Glenda, sent to the rest of the board. "Waylon's a problem. If we can't get him off that spot, we need to make his life difficult until he volunteers to stop parking there. I don't care what his deed says. We change the rules, we change the perception." Below that was a reply from another board member named Sharon. "This is legally risky. He has documented ownership. We could be sued." Glenda replied, "He won't sue. He's just a mechanic or something." I read that line 3 times. I'm a trauma nurse at the county hospital. The emails continued. One mentioned trying to incentivize the tow company with a small donation from the HOA discretionary fund. Another suggested losing my annual HOA dues payment to put me in delinquency and start fines. The last email chilled me. "If we can fine him 3 times, we can file for lien proceedings under the bylaw amendment. That'll force him to comply or sell." I snapped a photo of every page and sent them to the Neighborhood Legal Advisory Board along with a brief summary. Then I called my attorney and asked if this qualified as criminal conspiracy. He said it did. We contacted a local reporter who had covered HOA abuse cases before. She met with me 2 days later, sitting in my living room with a recorder, notepad, and a lot of strong opinions about power-mad HOA boards. I gave her everything: the sticker, the tow order, the emails, the certified deed, even the QR code Glenda used to launch her fake petition. She was gone 40 minutes and promised to call before the article went live. That night, I received a call from a blocked number. "Waylon Dorsey? Speaking. This is Detective Alvarez from the County Sheriff's Department. We received a report concerning potential HOA fraud and civil conspiracy. I'd like to schedule a time to speak in person. We met the next morning and I laid everything out. He took a dozen photos, recorded my statement, and said they'd already begun interviewing board members. Apparently, Sharon, the one who warned Glenda in that email, had come forward voluntarily. By the end of that week, 3 events happened in rapid succession. First, the city issued a temporary injunction halting all HOA enforcement actions related to parking until a full review could be completed. Second, the sheriff's office confirmed it had opened a joint investigation with the district attorney's office into the HOA's misuse of funds, attempted fraud, and harassment of residents. And third, the article went live. The headline read, "Local HOA VP caught targeting homeowner in parking conspiracy documents reveal attempted lien scheme." It went viral. Neighbors who had avoided me for weeks now crossed the street just to say hi. Ed taped a copy of the article on his mailbox. One woman baked me a pie. Even the mailman gave me a thumbs up. But the real show came the following Tuesday when the HOA held an emergency meeting at the community clubhouse. The room was packed. Cameras, residents, 2 city council reps, and one very uncomfortable-looking Glenda sitting up front with 3 empty chairs beside her. The rest of the board had resigned. I walked in with my deed in one hand and the certified plat map in the other. The council reps didn't even let Glenda speak before reading a formal statement. Due to pending criminal charges, she was suspended from all HOA duties effective immediately. She stood up, voice shaking, and tried to shout something about misunderstandings and protecting the neighborhood. But no one was listening anymore. The fluorescent lights in the community clubhouse buzzed overhead as Glenda gathered her papers with trembling hands, her mouth pressed in a thin line. She wasn't escorted out yet, but the atmosphere made it clear she was no longer in charge of anything. The city council reps wrapped up their statements, and a few neighbors began to leave in quiet clusters, murmuring their disbelief to one another. I stayed in my seat, arms crossed, watching Glenda stare at the back wall like it held the answer to how her plan had unraveled so thoroughly. She hadn't looked in my direction once. After the room cleared out, one of the council reps approached me. He was a younger guy, maybe early 30s, with a navy blazer and a notepad tucked under his arm. "You did the right thing coming to us," he said. "Most folks just try to ride it out when HOAs go rogue." I nodded. I wasn't about to let someone rewrite property law because they didn't like my truck. He glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Between us, the DA's office flagged this case as high priority. "There's evidence Glenda funneled money into a private account under a landscaping company that doesn't exist. If that pans out, it won't just be civil court." I leaned in slightly. "How'd they find that?" He tilted his head toward the door. "Someone on the board forwarded a reimbursement form she submitted last month. Claimed the HOA paid Green Haven Maintenance $6,000 for tree trimming. Problem is, no one in the neighborhood saw any work done. No invoice, either just a hand-signed approval." I let that settle. "So this goes beyond my driveway. Way beyond. We're talking fraud, embezzlement, and possibly mail tampering. If she used HOA letters to push her agenda, that's federal." By the time I got home, my inbox had a message from Detective Alvarez. He wanted to schedule a follow-up at my house the next day. I agreed and made sure all the documents were laid out on the dining table, including the anonymous packet of emails. True to his word, Alvarez showed up just after 10 the next morning. He brought a woman with him, Detective Mendez, introduced as part of the Financial Crimes Division. She had a tablet and a calm, clipped way of speaking that made it clear she was used to people lying to her. "We're expanding the investigation," Mendez said as she sat at my table and flipped open a leather folder. "Did you ever receive any HOA letters that didn't come through the mail?" I thought back. "Yeah, the notice about fines, they were just taped to my door." No envelope, no postage. She nodded and tapped something on her screen. We believe Glenda avoided using the postal system once she realized misuse of mailed notices could bring federal charges. Taping things to doors kept it local. Sloppy but intentional, Alvarez added. Did you ever authorize any HOA fee increases? Never even saw a ballot, I said. They stopped sending me notices after I challenged the parking thing. Mendez looked up. That aligns with other residents' reports. We think she deliberately excluded non-compliant homeowners from voting materials. We're building a case for voter suppression under HOA governance rules, which, combined with the financial issues, paints a very ugly picture. I showed them one more thing, something I hadn't thought was relevant until now. A small note I'd found stuck in my mailbox 2 weeks earlier. It had no signature, no handwriting, just a typed message. You'll lose more than a parking spot if you don't back down. Alvarez took a photo. Did you keep the original in the freezer? I said. Old trick I learned from my uncle, preserves fingerprints if there are any. That got a grin out of him. Smart man. They left with the note and a copy of the emails. I locked the door behind them and exhaled. That evening, the neighborhood erupted again, but this time not because of me. A squad car and 2 unmarked vehicles pulled up in front of Glenda's house just as the sun started to set. Word spread fast. Within minutes, people were standing on porches or peeking through blinds. A few had phones out, recording silently. Glenda opened the door, still in her pressed slacks and floral print blouse like she just stepped out of a catalog. Her expression didn't change when the officers started speaking. But when they handed her an arrest warrant, her face drained like someone had flipped a switch. She didn't argue. Not a word. Just turned, walked back inside, and re-emerged with a purse slung over her shoulder. One of the detectives placed her in handcuffs. She didn't look at anyone, not even as a neighbor's dog barked from across the street. They placed her in the back of the car, and the convoy rolled away. By the next morning, the story had hit the local paper again, this time with the headline, HOA Vice President Arrested in Widening Fraud Investigation. It listed charges: wire fraud, embezzlement, falsifying governance documents, and attempted coercion. They also mentioned the anonymous tip that kicked off the deeper probe. Someone had forwarded internal records to the DA's office weeks before the parking dispute even started. I had a suspicion who it was. Sharon, the only board member who tried to pump the brakes. Later that week, the city called a meeting for all homeowners in our subdivision. It was held at the town library, in a meeting hall that smelled faintly of old books and lemon-scented cleaner. A city-appointed mediator stood at the front with a dry erase board outlining next steps. We're dissolving the current HOA structure under Emergency Clause 32, he said. A temporary oversight committee will manage essential tasks until a formal election can be held. All previous fines issued in the last 6 months are frozen, pending review. Someone in the back raised a hand. What happens to the money she spent? Mendez, seated near the front, stood to answer. If the court finds she misappropriated funds, the state will pursue asset recovery. That includes seizing personal property to reimburse the HOA account. Another voice. Can she go to prison? She's facing felony charges, Mendez said. It's likely. No one cheered. No one clapped, but the room felt lighter, like a knot had been loosened at the center of the neighborhood. After the meeting, I stepped outside and found Sharon leaning against the brick wall, arms folded. I didn't know how far she'd go, she said before I even spoke. I thought she was just overzealous. Then she started locking me out of meetings and rewriting minutes. I couldn't stay silent. You did the right thing, I said. She looked down at her shoes. I'm sorry you had to be the one in her crosshairs. I'm not, I replied. It brought everything else into the light. That night, I finally parked my truck in my spot without checking the street first. No stickers, no notes, just concrete and quiet. A few days later, I started building a small wooden barrier along the edge of the spot, not because I needed to, but because I could. I added solar lights, a row of potted succulents, and a little sign that read "Reserved since the beginning." As I tightened the last screw, Ed walked by with his dog and gave me a nod. "Looks permanent," he said. "It is now," I replied. He tipped his cap. About time someone stood up to the nonsense. I didn't respond, just took a step back and looked at the space that nearly cost me peace, time, and a whole lot of sanity. It wasn't just a parking spot anymore. It was proof that even when someone in power tries to rewrite the rules, the truth and a little persistence still wins. A week after the emergency HOA meeting, I got a certified letter in the mail. This time, it wasn't taped to my door or stuffed halfway into the mailbox like Glenda used to do. It came from the county court. Inside was a summons. Glenda had filed a civil suit against me, the claim: defamation, harassment, and obstruction of HOA governance. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the paper like it might change if I blinked enough. It didn't. I called my attorney, Calvin, who listened without interrupting. "She's doubling down," he said flatly. "Probably trying to flip the narrative before the criminal trial starts. This is a preemptive strike to make herself look like the victim. She's got no case. She knows that," he said. "This isn't about winning in court. It's about dragging you through it." We filed a motion to dismiss the next morning, including all the evidence already in the DA's hands. Calvin also requested the court penalize her for abuse of process. That was the legal term for what she was doing, using the system to harass someone with no legitimate claim. While that was in motion, I got a call from someone I didn't expect. It was the new interim chair of the HOA Oversight Committee, a quiet man named Howard Kessler. He sounded like he'd rather be reading a financial spreadsheet than dealing with neighborhood politics, but I liked him immediately for that reason. "I've reviewed your documents," he said. "You're the only homeowner with a deeded parking space." It was a one-time variance granted during construction when the developer's brother bought the unit before public sale. It was recorded properly. "You're in the clear," I exhaled. "Appreciate it." "There's something else," he said. "We pulled financials from the last 6 years. Glenda's name is on over 40 reimbursements that don't line up with any actual work. We flagged 17 that were submitted during her time as vice president. The DA's office is requesting forensic audits now." I wasn't surprised. But hearing the scale of it laid out like that made my skin crawl. Howard continued, "We're contacting all homeowners to let them know about a temporary HOA fee freeze. Until the audits are complete, we're not collecting another dime. We'll also be holding a vote to dissolve the current bylaws and replace them under city oversight." "Sounds like a clean start," I said. "That's the idea." The next day, I was back at the hospital. It felt good to focus on something that didn't involve lawsuits or meeting minutes. I was halfway through a shift when Calvin called again. "The judge tossed her case this morning." I stepped into the break room, shutting the door behind me. "She show up?" "Nope. Her attorney withdrew last minute. Apparently she stopped paying him after the arrest." "Judge dismissed with prejudice, which means she can't refile." I let that sink in. "So that's it?" "Almost. The DA's office is moving forward with formal charges this week. I got a call from the investigator. They want you to testify at the preliminary hearing." I agreed without hesitation. The hearing came 3 days later. The courthouse was smaller than I expected, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and even the bailiff handed out coffee in the waiting area. Glenda was there, seated next to a public defender, looking withdrawn. Gone was the sharp blouse and clipboard. She wore a gray cardigan and flats. Her expression never changed. The state laid out its case in quiet, methodical detail. The prosecution entered into record 17 fraudulent reimbursements, 3 attempts to initiate lien proceedings through forged documents, and 1 instance of wire fraud involving a falsified landscaping invoice sent to an out-of-state account traced back to an LLC Glenda had registered under her niece's name. My testimony wasn't long. I confirmed the events, provided documentation, and answered questions about how the parking dispute had escalated. When they asked about the emails, I explained how I received them and what they contained. Her attorney didn't cross-examine me. Afterward, I stepped outside into the cold wind and stood on the courthouse steps. I'd expected to feel triumphant, maybe even vindicated, but mostly I just felt like I could finally breathe. 2 weeks later, Glenda accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of attempted property interference. In exchange, she avoided prison but was ordered to pay over $75,000 in restitution to the HOA and was permanently barred from serving in any fiduciary role in a residential community. Her home was placed in a forced sale to satisfy part of the judgment. I didn't go to the sentencing. I didn't need to. What mattered was what happened after. The Oversight Committee held a neighborhood-wide forum at the library, this time not as a crisis meeting, but a rebuilding one. People showed up carrying coffee, homemade muffins, and folding chairs from their garages. There were no accusations, no tension, just neighbors trying to move forward. Howard stood at the front and laid out a new set of draft bylaws. Simpler, transparent. Every homeowner would have direct access to board finances through an online portal. All votes would require a quorum and third-party verification. When he finished, he looked around the room. "We'd like to form a new board," he said, "with people who want to protect the community, not control it." He glanced at me. "Waylon, would you consider serving?" A few people turned toward me. I hadn't expected that. I stood slowly. "I'll help you write the enforcement clauses." But I've had enough paperwork to last a lifetime. There were a few laughs and then applause, real ones, not the scattered kind. Afterward, Ed caught me on the way out. He carried a box of leftover donuts and a stack of flyers for the upcoming community cleanup day. "You know," he said, "my wife always said Glenda was the type to build a fence around nothing and charge you to look over it." "Sounds about right." He handed me a flyer. "We're repainting the benches around the pond Saturday. You in?" I nodded. "Count me in." As I walked home, I passed Glenda's house, or what used to be hers. The windows were bare. A "for sale by court order" sign hung crooked in the yard. The lawn was already growing patchy. No one waved from the porch. I didn't slow down. Back at my house, I pulled into the driveway. My driveway. The spot was still lined with potted plants, the little wooden sign still intact. I'd added a motion light above it a few days ago, more out of habit than need. I got out and looked at it for a long moment. It wasn't just a victory over a parking dispute. It was proof that bad power could be broken, that the system, when pushed hard enough, could still work the way it was meant to. Inside, I threw my jacket over the chair and opened the window to let in the breeze. Somewhere, a dog barked. Kids were riding bikes again near the cul-de-sac. The neighborhood was quieter now, not empty, just calm. I sat down, finally at peace in the home I'd fought to protect, and watched the sun settle over the edge of the roofline, casting a soft orange light across the pavement, right across my parking spot.